Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, May 13th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,500 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part one. It was about World Trade Center 7, the third tower that collapsed on 9/11. This is part two, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Mr. Andy Steele, and the host of 9/11 Freefall. Andy, how you doing?
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Just want to let you know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will definitely occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is go to ae911truth.org. Go to the live, go to continuing education and then select the live webinars. You'll see a box right there. I'll also be looking over Facebook and YouTube to see any good comments or questions related to the material that is being presented, specifically under this presentation, the video presentation of it. So with all of that explained, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible here at a local firm in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the Twin Towers using the material in these courses. So let's get into it. First of all, a note about the design of the Twin Towers. Some called it heartless modernism, others the crowning achievement of the international style. Robert Stern called it gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. Compare that to the beautiful, unfolding, elegant massing of the Art Deco styled Empire State Building, which up until the time the Twin Towers were built was the tallest building in the world. So there were a number of structural innovations, though, associated with this building, not the least of which was getting 50,000 occupants and 140,000 visitors to their site in the building every day. An extraordinary feat accomplished with 100 elevator cabs stopping at 1/3 points along the height of the building and transferring to elevators that would then take them to their respective sections. That was a novel concept, as was the structural innovations here, because up till this time, the skyscrapers had a forest of columns in these severely impacting, including the Empire State Building, the layout of the spaces. What they did with the Twin Towers was push half the columns out to the outside and grouped half of the rest of them on the inside. So the outside is a perimeter structural steel system, some call an exoskeleton, with 3 horizontal spandrel panels welded in the factory to 3 vertical columns. In the center, we have 47 massive core columns, like this one at mid-height, 32 inches by 16 inches. No, 30 inches by 22 inches. And then solid steel at the bottom. Now, between these 2 structures, if you will, was laid the lightweight steel trusses, which spanned 60 feet on one side and 30 feet on the other, and over which was poured a concrete slab on metal decking. So this is an extraordinary innovation in and of itself because of the open office planning that it allowed. As you can see on the one side, 60 feet between the perimeter and the structural core here, and 30 feet on the other, allowing an unimpeded layout of offices by tenants. Now, there were still some problems associated here. As the 80s came along, the skyscrapers opened up their views even further. Because here, as you can see, there's a marching set of columns that's some called like a jail cell, every 3 feet 4 inches on center all the way around the building. The ceilings were deemed to be relatively low, and by the time of 9/11, 2001, the buildings certainly required billions and billions of dollars of upgrades in mechanical, electrical, and communication systems, not to mention the abatement of asbestos, which was being required by the city of the Port Authority to comply with federal regulations. So it's curious why we have at this time Larry Silverstein, who invested only $15 million of his money to secure the rest of the World Trade Center towers, buildings 1 through 6. He had already in the 80s built building 7, World Trade Center 7, which we talked about last week. When he knew that all of these incredibly expensive, $15 billion it's estimated up to, for all of these required renovations. And then he put massive terrorist insurance on the buildings that were enormously more extensive than anything the Port Authority had done previously. But let's look at how this official story developed here.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here's the official story in a nutshell, and we're going to proceed to examine that quite critically today. But let's look at the airplane impacts. We have the North Tower hit at 8:46 in the morning. It's hit about 15 stories down from the top, and it collapses over an hour and a half later. A lot of people associate the impact of the airplanes and that incredible explosion of jet fuel with the collapse of these buildings. But this is even Nist acknowledges that most of the jet fuel burns up outside the building. The rest of it is gone, they say, in 10 minutes. So it's normal office fires, essentially, and some broken columns that are is the summary narrative of how the buildings came down. United Flight 175 hits the World Trade Center South Tower 30 stories down, and it's the first to collapse just an hour later, though it was hit second. And so we're going to disassociate in your mind the common myth that it's that horrendous initial explosion that brought down these buildings. Even the official story, in which there were several investigations into here, including the American Society of Civil Engineers, starting with volunteers who worked themselves into each of the subsequent investigations for the most part. FEMA, which finally got $600,000 worth of funding, which is a pittance compared to any of the national tragedies we've had that had to be investigated. But even their efforts were quite hampered. According to the New York Times, they couldn't get access to the site, couldn't get access to the blueprints of the building, couldn't get access to the steel. It's remarkable that they were able to put together a report on this building at all. Nist comes along in 2002, takes over the investigation, and they finally receive from Congress $20 million, though they've never investigated a building collapse before. They were put in charge of this. They're part of the executive branch of government under the Department of Commerce, whose leadership was changed out when the Bush administration came in, both in Nist and in the Department of Commerce. What was their assessment? That these raging fires that occurred, that were started by the jet fuel, softened the steel of the long span lightweight steel joists because the fireproofing had been knocked off of them by the impact of the airplane, allegedly. And then this caused the floor structure to sag, which caused the pulling in of these columns. Now we'll see later that the columns did pull in, and we'll take a look and see what happened. But it certainly wasn't as a result of the lightweight steel trusses sagging, because lightweight steel trusses don't have the lateral force necessary to pull in these 14-inch square steel tube columns. So they imposed in their computer model an artificial 5,000-pound load all the way around the building at each truss connection in order to fail the building in their computer modeling. So the fires themselves weren't even that hot and nor extensive as Nist alleges. As you can see, at the time of the collapse, they're quite diminished. Chief Oriel Palmer says he could put it out in the South Tower minutes before it collapsed, losing his life therein with just 2 lines of fire. So indicated by the thick black smoke, we have oxygen-starved and cooler fires. So we use the scientific method at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. What is it? We have a question. How do the towers come down? We do some background research, make some observations, construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the towers came down. We have, did the jet planes bring them down? And maybe fire, the ensuing fires, or maybe explosions, for which we'll be looking at an awful lot of evidence today. All of the hypotheses are laid out, the ones that have rational backing. We don't focus on our favorite hypotheses to the exclusion of others based on our obligations politically or financially that might sway our objective opinion in the matter of the investigation. We'll also be looking at the hypothesis of controlled demolition very carefully today and next week in part 3 of this series. This is part 2. We test these hypotheses with experiments after making predictions. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis that stands a better chance against the evidence and the data and so forth until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated. There, Andy, I've added you back into the stream. If you want to go on mute, you'll be all set. So let's proceed but with some background research looking at the forces that destroy buildings. Fire is certainly a destructive force. It's an organic process. It's very chaotic, following the laws of entropy, increasing chaos. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so, and then moves on looking for fresh new combustibles. Now, this is even acknowledged by Nist in their report, that the fires didn't persist in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes. So, and on the other hand, they allege that these fires were growing hotter and hotter in the building under the floor trusses. So we have skyscrapers, fires that have occurred in skyscrapers, but they have never collapsed, as we'll see, due to fires, not steel frame fireproof skyscrapers, which is what we're talking about here. But say in wood frame buildings where not quite as tall as skyscrapers, but where there is nearly at all, but where there is a wood structure, the structure itself can be flammable, so they're protected. But when they do burn, they fall over in stages, not straight down through the tons of structure beneath, as if it weren't even there, which we'll be looking at carefully in a moment. But what happens in a steel frame building? Well, we have the largest test of its kind. An 8-story building was built with fireproofed and non-fireproofed steel structure that they wanted to test and see, well, what would happen? As you can see, there's extraordinary fuel loads in this. They wanted the worst case fire they could possibly get. And they burned this almost up to 2,000 degrees. And what did they find? That it's inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. See, even in this case, where this beam, for instance, and these connections are not even fireproofed, there's no failure. This is an incredibly relevant study that should have been included by Nist in their report, which proves the inherent stability of the structural steel form, let alone the portions that were fireproofed. So the connections did not fail. And as we looked at last week in Building 7, with normal post and beam construction above the 5th floor, we have connections that Nist claims failed all over the place. As we looked at about 400 structural steel connections failing every second in that building in their computer model. But not in Los Angeles, not in Philadelphia do we have the failure of structural of fires. In fact, let's take a look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did these other steel frame high-rises collapse due to fires, and they're fully engulfed. So we only have 3 examples, and each of those are on 9/11, World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7. The Twin Towers, again, did not even have hot fires or large or longer lasting than typical high-rise fires. So there's a real problem here that has to be met square on by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. These are natural collapses. We have buildings that are damaged, certainly, and look very damaged, but the concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. It doesn't fall like a house of cards. These buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of expanding, pulverized building materials and smoke, expanding in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat released from the chemical ignition of these explosives. So if we have these features, including sounds of explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them, we know we have explosions. Now, explosions are not a part of the official story, save the impact of the aircraft and some explosions in the lobby attributed to dripping fuel down 100 stories of elevator shaft, which is impossible because there's only 2 of those elevator shafts that go all the way, two of those cabs that go all the way down to the bottom. And those are not the ones that are damaged. We have a process called controlled demolition, which explosions are used quite carefully and set off in synchronistically timed floor by floor, placed in shaped cutter charges against the columns and beams in the building. So they can bring the building down really any way they want, straight down or over or into its own footprint, as we saw last week in the case of Building 7. If you missed that, by the way, you can watch it for free on YouTube. Just search on YouTube 9/11 An Architect's Guide, Part 1, World Trade Center 7, or some part of that. So we have only a handful of companies that can accomplish this in the United States. And there's a set of features associated with typical controlled demolitions, such as a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint quite often, because the patterned removal of column supports yields that result. In feature number 4, there's a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path that should have been the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure beneath the support that was supporting the structure for its life. So we have total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. That's the whole idea, to bring structural high-rises down by controlled demolition. And there's limited damage to adjacent structures, of course. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. There's patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. The concrete floors are broken up, typically. They don't want to have to go back there and jackhammer that, so they'll break up those floors so that they can ship it away. There's explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. And feature number 10, of course, there's explosive devices or chemical residue of such left behind. So if you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. So that's really important, because we're going to be looking at all of them today and next week, part 3 of this series, next week. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically and with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance. Why did we not understand how, why don't steel frame structures collapse due to fire? Well, one reason is that steel is very dense. It conducts the heat away from its source. So the steel beam, for instance, rarely gets to its critical temperature, 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. We want to make sure that never happens, so we put cementitious fireproofing on these. 4 to 6 times more than we think we'll ever need. Remember, the fire in a given area only can last 20 to 30 minutes. So if we put 2 hours on the beams and 3-hour fire protection on the column, we've really secured that building, giving the occupants plenty of opportunity to get out in case that fire gets out of control. So we will also keep the contractor from building the high-rises out of combustible materials and keep the tenants from bringing in large fuel loads. So with all of that, plus sprinkler systems, we can keep the fire from really ever becoming a problem. In the case of the Twin Towers, the sprinklers were said to have been compromised by the impact of the airplanes. And we don't argue that point, because we focus on the evidence for controlled demolition at AE 911 Truth. We also look, though, at circumstantial corroborative evidence such as government documentation, foreknowledge, people know in advance if there's a controlled demolition, experts corroboration, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building was brought down with controlled demolition or not. Along with video documentation, this can be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we're going to apply to the Twin Towers, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction? And where? At the location of the jet plane impacts, not at the base of the structure, as is typical in controlled demolitions. You see, you're going to find today that this is a magic show we've been presented with. We're asked to focus on the fires and the jet fuel and the explosions there. So that's where that's what the magician is showing us. the perpetrators of 9/11. What's going on behind the scenes is what we're going to be looking at today also, such as the fact that there's no jolt or hesitation upon the impact of this upper section to the lower section. It just starts suddenly and smoothly and continues straight down. And we'll look at the rest of this collapse later. But same thing in the South Tower. It's standing still, and all of a sudden it's in smooth, continuous motion, no jolt or hesitation, because we're told that the upper section is colliding with the lower section. If that were true, we would see such a jolt and hesitation. Is there patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Well, let's go to the oral histories in which City Fire Commissioner Thomas Von Eschen commissioned the oral recordings of 500 of his first responders a month after 9/11 in order to preserve the accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory, which they have anyway. But had anybody had the opportunity to read this in the first 4 years, which they couldn't because the New York City was not releasing this information. And so the New York Times sued them. And finally, the New York Court State of Appeals forced them to release it to the New York Times, and they published these accounts. Let's look at a few of them. It turns out that 118 of these first responders are observing flashes, sounds of explosions, hearing them, and phenomena of explosive demolition, such as these. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, you're going to hear them describing a very specific order of events. Hearing the explosions or feeling the explosions before the tower comes down. Look, all of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It actually shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all four sides. Material shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building? There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building? Oh, that's the second time we have that in there. Hang on, I'll make a note. Clear that one out. Dupe. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's see what they're talking about here. A known controlled demolition on the left. The North Tower on the right. Slowing it down halfway. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a steel frame skyscraper, ever. Should it not have been the first hypothesis, since it's the only rational one? But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions of Nist and published only years later on their website. What do they say? Well, the question is, why didn't Nist consider controlled demolition hypothesis? We do not support the controlled demolition theory. A collapse was initiated at the impact and the fire floors and the World Trade Center towers and nowhere else, meaning that if it didn't start at the bottom of the building, it couldn't be a controlled demolition. We'll challenge that assumption in a moment. Video evidence also showed unambiguously that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. There's no evidence of any blast or explosions in the region below the impact. We will see lots of evidence today. Nist found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the towers were brought down by controlled demolition. We'll see lots of that too. This firefighter or paramedic says, you ever see professional demolitions where they set charges on certain floors? You hear that pop, pop, pop. When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would just go all the way around the building on both sides. Let's take a look at the South Tower on the right, compared to a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, and especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never in history brought down a steel frame fireproof skyscraper. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. Another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Do you see any flashes? I said, yeah, well, I thought it was just me. She said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think, at that point, still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. He said, you mean when it fell down? I said, no, when it exploded. Let's listen to these credible witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
a huge explosion now waiting to bring on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated. Detonated. Plans to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses do you imagine were included in the report by Nist? 0, not 1. And yet they claim to have interviewed hundreds of witnesses. How did they miss these? Are these accounts relevant to their topic of determining, as assigned by Congress, how the Twin Towers collapsed? Yeah, they're relevant. Nist says, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition. It didn't start at the bottom. Well, let's listen to expert Mark Loiseau.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
There's a top-down controlled demolition right there. Nist says, well, the upper block of floors, in the case of the North Tower, about 15 floors, drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Well, there's a problem here. It's called Newton's third law of motion. A lighter structure cannot destroy a heavier, more massive structure. Can a Volkswagen destroy a Mack truck? Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. The lightest part of a structure it finds an equal and opposite destruction as it engages with the heavier mass. So it is the first to be destroyed. Remember, the lightest part of the structure is at the top. It's a virtual pyramid. As you go down, it gets heavier and heavier and heavier until halfway down, you have 16 by 52 inches, 2 inches thick beams, and then continuing heavier and heavier until you're almost solid steel at the base of the structure. Now, this theory comes from Zdenek Bezant of Chicago Northwestern University, a civil engineer who submitted a paper just 2 days after 9/11. This extremely complex and obfuscated paper with mathematical formulas that structural engineers had a hard time decoding. It's called the Bezant. It's called his crush down, crush up theory. How did he find time to work on this when the rest of us were trying to figure out what was going on in our country with this attack? And we're all in shock. And we're supposed to believe that he is sitting there cranking out this paper, which became the justification for the crush down, crush up theory promoted by Nist. Well, it violates the laws of physics. The actual formula is correct in this paper, but it's been decoded by some structural engineers. They found that the input data is false. First of all, it's extremely difficult to critique. Also, they vanish. There's a complete story missing, so that they can develop a false artificial 12-foot drop in the upper section as if nothing was supporting it, a free fall drop to generate a dynamic load upon the structure below. But they had to do more than that fraud. They had to double the mass up above. Besant did. He had to decrease the column strength below by more than 3 times. And he had to ignore the velocity loss that would have been due to the conservation of momentum when one floor hits another, for instance, and the column reserve strength, which was 3 times more. So the results of these errors is that we have a rigged calculation, 12-1 at least, more like 24-1, in favor of a collapse. It's complete fraud. So this was challenged by several, not the least of which was David Chandler, who actually measured the free fall or near free fall of this building, as we'll see. Finds that it would have been, the downward movement would have been arrested 2 seconds into any kind of a natural collapse, as we're told this was. It wouldn't have gone all the way down to the ground. So this has been refuted now by engineers Tony Zambodi and Richard Johns in 2 separate papers submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers, where this original theory was published. And they refuse to publish it. Why? The Journal of Engineering and Mechanics says that it's out of scope. Well, hey, why is it out of scope to publish a paper that refutes the results of a previously published paper in that journal? It's not out of scope. And so there is a challenge to this refusal that continues in an appeal process today. We'll report to you on the results of that. So, but let's look at the upper section of this building and see what it's doing. You can see that it's not driving the rest of the building down to the ground. Well, let me make it easier for you. Watch the bottom red line. There's no driving down until possibly 3-4 seconds later. What's happening is the upper part, just like the Volkswagen would be, is being destroyed. And we'll look at some of those destructive forces in a minute. But you can see as we start and stop, just like the first responders noticed, all the way around the building, these explosions all around all 4 sides of the building. Now, we'll continue with that exploration in a moment, but we're told that it's the sagging floor trusses that pulled in these perimeter columns. Well, the perimeter columns are being pulled in on each side of the corner, as you see in this looped video. They're being pulled in again and again. The question is, what's pulling them in? Now, we can go back to the FEMA report with Gene Corley.
When the collapse finally starts,
For a clue.
the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
So the core columns let go first. The theory on the part of Nist is that the perimeter columns were failed due to the sagging floor trusses. Let's look at the antenna. Down 2, up 2. I'm looking at the top of the antenna relative to the frame of this line. Down 2, up 2. It's falling before the perimeter of the parapet of the skyscraper is falling. And that confirms FEMA's findings that the antenna drops first. Well, what does the antenna sit on? It sits on this hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on these core columns. So the core columns are proven here as to be what's failing first under the point of jet plane impacts. And then the hat truss fails, and then the core columns pull on the floor trusses. And that can be seen somewhat crudely in this animation, where the core columns are cut low, and then they fail, and they pull on these these lightweight floor trusses, which then pull on the respective spandrel panels, causing the perimeter columns to bow inward. And nowhere in any of the photographs do we see a pile driver crushing the rest of the building. Not in the videos, not in the photographs. What we do see in this video is the remaining section of core columns was still standing 6 seconds after the collapse of the rest of the structure. It would have been destroyed if there was an upper section of building crushing the rest of the building. This video alone completely removes the feat from the Nist report and from the Besant theory. And then there's an explosion which shakes the dust off of these columns, and then they descend through that dust which has been shaken off. So it looks more like a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea, with upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, solid objects ejected, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Now, why are steel beams trailing thick white smoke clouds? We'll come to that. And just looking at it, does it look anything like a gravitational collapse to you? This is why 36 reporters, the vast majority of reporters on the day of 9/11, reported that we're talking about explosions having been responsible for bringing down the towers. This is eyewitness reporting, narrative reporting, source-based reporting. And reporters who, many of whom changed their stories to support the official story afterwards. They conclude, Ted Walter and Graham McQueen, the authors of this important report, that the hypothesis of explosions bringing down the towers was not only prevalent among reporters, but was in fact the dominant hypothesis. Let's see, do we have a straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint of the building, not inside, like we saw in part 1 of this series about World Trade Center 7, the third tower that came down? Well, let's look. The South Tower begins to fall, and yes, it begins to fall over. So we have asymmetrical from the loading, asymmetrical loading on the building below from this part that's falling off. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires. Why then do we have complete symmetry all the way down all 4 sides of the building? It's a complete non sequitur. And if we zoom in on one of these sides, what do we see? The natural collapse is supposed to be 24 floors up above. In this leading corner of destruction, we're seeing hundreds of explosions right here before our eyes, individually. Hundreds of small individual explosions. This is not a massive explosion. It is hundreds of individual explosions. And this is, again, one of the key videos that you can show anybody. So mark this time in this video and share it with everybody. By the way, while you're sharing stuff, share the whole video and like and subscribe the video. That really helps us get the message out, if that's what you want to do. We also have in the lower right corner here that same set of explosions, looking at it from a different angle, racing down the corner of the building. In addition to these squibs or isolated explosions, which we see ejecting out of the building. We'll look at those in a moment. There's a 1,200-foot diameter of destruction around each of these buildings. The building's only 200 feet wide, but it's symmetrical about each of the towers. The distribution of these 4-ton and 8-ton structural steel sections, destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away. The steel frame is completely broken up, cut up, ready for loading and shipment. Compare the massive explosion to the perfect implosion of Building 7, the third tower that came down, that wasn't hit by an airplane, that we looked at in part 1 of this series. So it's the Twin Towers are a very explosive event. Let's look at these ejections of materials. We have 20 stories, 60 stories even down below the destruction of easily seen squibs or isolated explosive ejections. They shouldn't be there. Nist says, well, these are a result of that pile driver driving the building down to the ground. Well, we saw that that couldn't happen and didn't. So there's no piston, if you will, pushing this air out, which Nist says has got to come out somewhere, right? And it's not air, by the way. It's pulverized building solids, which are occurring at 50 to 200 feet per second. Looking at the South Tower on the left side in this looped video over and over again, you see dozens of squibs or isolated explosive ejections occurring randomly, indicating that the structure of this building is being liquefied, if you will, such that it doesn't fall off the structure below, but it settles back in. Let's look at these squibs with physics teacher David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second or 150 miles per hour.
100. That's way faster, 160 to 200 feet per second. These are explosive speeds, not air pressure from a building falling out. How fast is the building coming down? Well, we can do a little analysis ourselves here. Look on the right, an animation. On the left, a countdown. Here's 4 seconds. 6 seconds. 8 seconds. 12 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, the entire building, both of them, have been destroyed. Nist says this is essentially at free fall. It's been clocked, though. Let's go back to physics teacher David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
So this building is falling and accelerating, not slowing down. It's getting faster and faster each second at 2/3 of free fall acceleration. Through what? Through 80,000 tons of structural steel beneath it that's designed to keep it from going anywhere. Well, what happened to that steel? Remember, even when steel bends, it still provides at least 25% of its reserve strength. But here we have 90% of the structural steel strength somehow completely gone. Well, we saw the explosions traveling down the face of the building. Let's look at this another way. We take a 15-story section of building, hold it up over nothing but air. We take that same section of building, hold it up, say 12 feet above the structure below to give it that fraudulent free fall of 12 feet before it impacts the building, before, like Zdeněk Bezant did. And under that, we'll put 80,000 tons of structural steel, 5 times stronger than it needs to be to resist the static load above it. What's going to happen when we release the lever on these cranes? Well, this is basically 7th grade physics, right? You can do this intuitively. The one on the right is going to fall at free fall, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. The one on the left is going to impact a structure and then slow down. We know this intuitively. It's not rocket science. You can get this. But we have explanations from experts in Nist that basically tell us came down essentially at free fall, as if the structure somehow gave up its will. Let's look at it another way. Massimo Mizuko's New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by Nist.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do apply, of course, and this is a reason for yet another submittal into, in this case, the Journal of Protective Structures by Gregory Zudolinski, Anthony Zamboni, and Richard Johns. So, which in this case was published. So, feature number 6, the steel frame. What happened to it? Did it shatter? Well, this is one of the problems that the National Fire Protection Association 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, says to look for, such as effects of explosions, shrapnel effects, high-order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris, with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances. If you have this, you know you have explosions. And look at the Twin Towers, completely shattered, save the remaining shards standing at the bottom. This is shrapnel effects. The structural frame is completely shattered down to the original lengths of the columns in their 37.5-foot lengths ready for loading and shipment. Do we have the lateral ejection of structural steel? Well, again, let's go back to NFPA 921 and says, look for blast pressure wave effects with heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, as we see impaled in the buildings all around it, and again destroying the winter gardens at the World Financial Center, 500 and 600 feet away. So we do see in these videos freely flying structural steel sections landing 300 to 600 feet in every direction, such as this particularly interesting one. Wait. Back 2, forward 2. That's 45 degrees. How does gravity work? Down. What's going on here? Out. Some incredibly powerful force has ejected this structural steel piece weighing up to 4 tons out. And trailed by thick white smoke clouds, I thought that structural steel was not flammable under conditions of office fires. This has not been explained at all. But David Chandler does a pretty good job analyzing the ejection of these steel pieces. Well, this is interesting. Let's try that one again.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower.
I'll try to do that again so it doesn't flash your eyes out. Let's try this.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds. I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
80 miles per hour out of the side, and I mean out, not down. That's enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's that energy coming from? And by the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is ejected outside the tower's footprint, then what's crushing the building? This is 1/3 of the weight of these skyscrapers, each of the skyscrapers. You say, well, maybe it was the concrete floors. We'll come back to that right now as we look for evidence of the concrete floors, because we're looking for them and we don't find them. They're not down at the bottom. These floors are an acre in size, each of them. 110 of them. We don't find 50 of them. We don't find 10. We don't find 1. All we see is a 2-story pile of perimeter columns and miscellaneous metal. What we should be looking at is 110 floors damaged but stacked up in some fashion. Where are they? It's missing. 90,000 tons of concrete is missing. Here it is, pulverized in midair to a fine powder, as seen in all of the photos and videos right before our eyes, pulverized to 100 micron particles on average, as indicated or analyzed by the agencies that looked at it, and distributed outside the footprint in a 3-inch thick blanket of dust that covered lower Manhattan from river to river, dust which was analyzed by the U.S. Geological Survey, which found up to 30% of that dust is powdered concrete. And 26 to 50% of it is gypsum board. So that's another third of the weight of the building. Let's go to the governor.
You see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there was 90,000 tons of concrete dust, but it was outside the footprint. So if it was outside the footprint, what was crushing the building? It wasn't the steel. So together, the concrete and steel comprise 2/3 the weight of this building. That's not available to crush the building. Again, completely pulling the rug out from underneath the theoretical basis for Nist's crush down, crush up theory, Zdenek-Bizant's submittal 2 days before 9/11. They found one file cabinet. Maybe there were 10,000 steel file cabinets. This is the only one they could find. It was in the basement. Maybe that's why it survived. What about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments found on top of this building, the Deutsche Bank building. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because when it hit World Trade Center 2, its ejections went out this way. They couldn't have been from the people in this airplane because those ejections were blocked by World Trade Center 2 from landing on the Deutsche Bank building. And they weren't from the people in the planes anyway. Many of them were from firefighters, in fact, who weren't even on the site until after the planes hit the buildings. Firefighters are the red triangles. So we have a problem here. There were 2,753 victims at the World Trade Center. 300 whole bodies found. That's it. 300. 21,900 pieces of bodies altogether. 6,000 small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,100 victims remain completely unaccounted for. Not a trace to get DNA from. They were vaporized. The pieces they did find are distributed over 800 feet away from the Twin Towers. Wouldn't we expect those pieces to be found very close to the Twin Towers, in fact, stacked between floors, which we should have also found? It's a very explosive event, and gravitational collapse can't possibly explain the pulverization and distribution of these body parts. We've been looking at direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, especially these fires, which are diminished in scope at the time of the collapse and are cooler, indicated by the thick black smoke. So we've also gained from the work of Graham McQueen from 118 witnesses up to 156 total witnesses among the 500 responders whose oral testimonies were so valuable. Now 156 witnesses of explosions. But here's probably the most important one. It's the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory 20 miles north, and it's recording seismic evidence. In fact, a 0.9 magnitude event upon the first impact, which is claimed to be a result of the impacting plane. And the second plane impact at the South Tower, a 0.7 magnitude event, which is said to be a result of that plane too. Okay, it makes sense. But let's look in a little more carefully. The seismic event occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds that morning, but the planes don't impact until 14 seconds later. So how can the plane impact cause the seismic event 14 seconds earlier? Well, this says we looked at the videos and we don't believe the NTSB radar, which the 9/11 Commission relied upon, which is accurate, by the way, to within 1 second. We looked at the videos and we think that the plane struck 10 seconds earlier. So they have this rationalization. And they're still 4 seconds off. What do they do with that discrepancy? They go back to LDEO and ask them to move their data back 3 seconds. And there was a report, but we can't get our hands on it because it's not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. How about the second plane impact? Because the seismic event occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds. This plane impact occurs 17 seconds later. So what does Nist do with this discrepancy? Once again, they ignore the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board radar, accurate to within a second. They ignore it and say, well, we looked at the videos and we came up with that the plane hit 12 seconds earlier. Well, okay, you're still off by 5 seconds. What do you do with that? Go back once again to LDEO, get them to move their seismic data back 3 seconds. We can't get the report. It's just a black box. No transparency whatsoever. What could explain those seismic events occurring 14 and 17 seconds earlier? Well, here's one explanation. Mike Percaro was down in the basement. Says the whole building began to shake. There was a loud explosion. When the two arrived at the sea level of the basement, the machine shop was gone. There was nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking structure, our garage, and found it too was gone. There were walls, no walls, rubble on the floor. You can't even see anything. A steel and concrete fire door weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil, lying on the ground. A bomb had gone off in the building. These witnesses also cite evidence of explosions before the plane even hit the building. Here's a janitor, Willie Rodriguez, working in the building. Uh-oh.
Was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
This is corroborated also by issue here. I'm going to restart the PowerPoint real quick and watch how fast I can do this. Hey.
I guess I should make sure people can hear me. Can you hear me, Richard?
Yeah, you sound great, Andy.
All right, cord got unplugged earlier, so I wasn't sure on that. Good opportunity to test.
Yeah, in fact, this would be a great opportunity, since I'm having a little interesting time here, to let people know what are the implications of a plane, of these explosions, even before the plane hits. This is extraordinary discussion that has not been very common out there.
Yeah, and these are the kind of details that people overlook in the malaise that follows an event like 9/11, because you just kind of glued to the TV or trusting the authorities to tell you what they're thinking or what the official explanation is. But in this case, if you have explosions before the plane impacts, well, I mean, that doesn't really need a lot of explanation. You have bombs going off prior to the impacts, and obviously giving credence to William Rodriguez's story about the explosion in the basement, other people who reported this. So just another thing to add to the mountain of evidence showing, at the very least, why we need a new investigation.
Yeah, and in fact, listen to Willie here.
Was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
Was a janitor.
You're going to hear him twice. So Andre Rousseau is an applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. He's giving a peer review of the work by the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory run by Columbia University. He says, hey, wait a minute, slow down, everybody. The frequency of the Raleigh waves attributed by LDEO to the impacts were on the order of only 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. But aircraft crash impacts have much higher frequencies, above 10 hertz, and often up around 100 hertz. But these frequencies are filtered out by the LDEO and their equipment. So he says it doesn't even allow for the recording of aircraft impacts, especially 20 miles away. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz. That's critically important. So they're not from the plane impacts. He says the actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened even before hitting the ground. They wouldn't even make it 20 miles north. So that's extremely important. Now, we also have seismic events occurring near the time of the collapses. And it's intuitive to believe, at first at least, that this is due to the collapses. We have a 2.1 magnitude event at the South Tower, and near the time of the North Tower's collapse, a 2.3 magnitude event. So the event itself occurs at 10:28 and 31 seconds, and the tower starts its descent though 9 seconds before that, and The first debris doesn't even hit the ground until a second after that. So how can it be responsible for the seismic event, especially since the heaviest debris doesn't even hit the ground for 4 seconds, 5 seconds after the surface waves. So what does Nist do with that? Well, they say, well, wait a minute. Let's go back to LDEO and get them to move their data back 3 seconds. That way we're only off by a second or so. Again, we can't get our hands on this report. It's just a private contract between Nist performing a duty for the public and the university, which is a private university, I guess, or not subject anyway to the Freedom of Information Act. But now, here's a problem. Completely overlooked by LDEO and unexplained are these very well-defined primary and shear waves. These are the Raleigh waves, the big ones. But something occurred, what? 4 seconds before the tower even started its descent. And as the tower is beginning its descent, these secondary waves, what could be responsible for those? We're going to be looking at explosions registered on cameras, which are mounted with tripods on the ground, both 6 and 10 seconds prior to the beginning of the tower's descent. Here's one. Look, the shake occurs right there. I didn't shake the camera. That's on the official. And then 6 seconds later, the smooth, sudden descent of the North Tower. This also occurs in a different camera mounted on the rooftop of another building. And the shake occurs here, right there. And 10 seconds later, in this case, the building drops like a rock straight down uniformly, symmetrically. Corroborating the first responders who heard explosions and felt explosions like a train running under my feet before the towers came down. In the South Tower, the start of the seismic event is 9:59 and 04 seconds. Okay. The start of the tower collapse is 5 seconds before that, but the heaviest debris, the first debris, doesn't even hit the ground until 7 seconds later. So how can it be responsible, the collapse of the tower, for the seismic event? Well, Nist again goes back and gets LDEO to move that data back 3 seconds for a fourth time so they can get their story corroborated. But we have evidence of what? Another camera shake occurring 3 seconds earlier than the start of the tower's collapse. Let's look at that one. By the way, this is done, this meticulous research by Graham McQueen in 2009 did the earth shake before the South Tower hit the ground. And yes, this one's more subtle, so watch carefully. There is the shake. And here is the collapse of the tower. So you can Google this yourself. Look at the meticulous work of Professor McQueen. The official narrative says it's due to the debris hitting the ground, but wait a minute, the debris doesn't even hit the ground. The concrete floor is turned to powder. You saw that. The steel peppered the top of a 7-story concrete basement structure. So it was isolated from the ground and peppering over 15 seconds and even well beyond the boundary of the World Trade Center complex itself, up to 600 feet outside each tower. So this is not contributing a seismic component. And remember, I mean, check this out. Each of these towers are nearly identical. Their collapse is nearly identical, but one of them has an energy release of 1.6 times that of the other. Now that's on an order of magnitude. A 2.1 versus a 2.3 is 1.6 times greater energy, and because of the logarithmic scale that seismic events are shown on. That is impossible to explain by the collapse all by itself. So Andre Rousseau says identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases. And this work in 2012. So this is all summarized in point TT7 of the Consensus 9/11 panel, the best 9/11 evidence produced by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin in their extraordinary website, consensus911.org, which looks at all the best evidence regarding the 9/11 events. So we have also some claiming that, gosh, the seismic component of the World Trade Center towers should have been much greater, given that the Seattle King Dome produced a 2.3 magnitude earthquake. Well, it had a 25,000 ton concrete roof, which hits the ground virtually at once. That is a real seismic component compared to the peppering and the concrete pulverized in the case of the Twin Towers. And the event, the detection equipment being 20 miles away in the case of the towers. So be sure to do your own research on this. We show you where to go, what to do here. Seismic proof. Did the earth shake? Were explosives the source? We also have Nist reports to look at today as well. Nist was given $20 million by Congress to determine what, how, and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. But they had their own objective, apparently. It's hidden on footnote 13, page 82 of their final report. It says the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? You stopped at the initiation? Didn't Congress ask you to explain the collapse itself? Why would they have stopped? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. They didn't do the job they were tasked with. Wait a minute. You had 10,000 pages, 2 years, $20 million, and you only produced a half a page answering Congress's question, how did the building collapse? Or why? And why? Let's read their half page. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure to absorb it through deformation. Came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wait a minute. This is not analysis. This is pure speculation. This is not rocket science. We've had structural engineers submit reports refuting those erroneous reports by Zdenek Bazant. You can figure out what happened here. Nist did not. They chose not to. Why? It's only a pre-collapse report. It should have been titled a final report on the initiation of collapse. Had they gone any further in their analysis, they would have had to have account for all of the evidence of explosive controlled demolition, which is available after and at the initiation of collapse. So we submitted a request for correction, which you can do with agencies that commit fraud like this. And they write back, well, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. All they did was speculate. And they admitted in their response, they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Okay, well, did you look? They finally admit that they didn't test for the presence of explosive residue. That is insincere at best. You can't find what you won't look for. Others did, though. Looked very carefully. William Rice. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free-fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer. Near free-fall collapse violates laws of physics. Fire protection engineer Scott Granger. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. Van Romero, director, the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center at Tech, New Mexico Tech, says explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers. It's too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with structures. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Now, he changed his story after getting a talking to by the people that fund the New Mexico Tech expert. New Mexico Tech, meaning the federal government, who does, because they do the explosive work for and studies for the federal government. I'm speculating on why that happened, but it's not too difficult to do. As did Mathis Levy change his story after he had said this originally.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
And Ronald Hamburger, who said originally, it appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonating, I was very surprised. Well, we showed you ample, abundant, irrefutable evidence today that bombs had been detonated. So where did he learn that no bombs had been detonated? Why did he buy it? That story. Mike Taylor. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers mirrored the strategy used by demolition experts. In controlled demolition, explosives are placed not just on the lowest 3 floors, but also on several consecutive floors about a third of the way up the building. It cascaded down like an implosion. The collapse of the Twin Towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. And Andre Rousseau, whom we just looked at, says even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 34 miles away. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. What about the evidence? What happened to all the structural steel beams and columns? Well, this structural engineer, who had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel, was complaining that it was being taken away even as he was trying to study it.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
Too little, too late. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling, he says, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads a day shipped to put on these barges and shipped to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting so many architects and engineers to cite the evidence of controlled demolition as the cause of this building's collapse through the use of the scientific method, with showing today 8 of 10 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. That's direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of it, not even one of these, let alone all of them, can be accounted for by the official theory or hypothesis that fires brought these buildings down. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, this is proof of controlled demolition, proof to so many architects, engineers, and millions of others throughout the growing 9/11 truth movement. And so with that, let's see if we can, people can ask some questions, right, Andy?
People can always ask questions, so please submit those now if you have them in the same input form we talked about before at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and the live webinars. There's a box right there, and we are going to do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved. Now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you, Andy. While you're there, subscribe to our newsletter. We put out the latest evidence we have, the latest efforts we're getting toward a real investigation. So stay with us, stay tuned, know what's going on, get the information, get the evidence. It's all on our website, an extraordinary body of evidence in video format and technical papers you can pass on. It's radio interviews. Sign the petition while you're there. Join 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition, and 20,000 others who are supporting them. You don't have to be an architect or an engineer. While you're there, support us. Donate. We have a lot of work that we still have to do, and we're working very hard every day to bring this information to the academics, the government, the media, and academic institutions, structural and architectural, physics departments. And in fact, becoming a member supports the organization itself. Join the family of sustaining supporters by giving monthly, as little as a cup of coffee a month, and that supports us. We have thousands of people supporting us at that level, and that's how we're able to do the miracles that we perform, the new films that we're about, and coming out in the 20th anniversary. Stay tuned. And lots of important work, including filming the structural engineers, the firefighters who are witnesses of explosions. And then they're backed up by engineers and architects and experts of all kinds. That's the extraordinary work that we're about for the 20th anniversary. And so become a member and volunteer if you can't do any of that. Andy, what are some of the ways people can help?
Yeah, absolutely. You can help out first by filling out the volunteer form. Join a great team of people who are here, who actually are here to help and want to work, and basically giving their hours every week. Sometimes little, sometimes a lot, and depending on the projects going on, but they contribute however they can. And how you help out really depends on your personality type. I say it every week, but it's super important. If you're the type of person that likes to keep to yourself, or you like to talk to people, we can find things for you to do. And there's always stuff to do around here. It's a big mission, big movement, and we need those folks who are serious and want to step out and do what needs to be done. So if you're considering that, you got a few hours, if you're on lockdown or whatever, and you want to help out to this important effort, then go ahead to ae911truth.org and fill out that form, and we'll get you to work.
Thank you, Andy. And there's so much you can do. So do join us on these teams. And you can do stuff on your own. Reach out to elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everybody you know. Screen the DVDs to your friends and colleagues. Share them. The brochures, you can get 100 of them for $10 on our website. And download the 130-page finite element analysis of World Trade Center Building 7 performed by one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country. Professor Leroy Halsey at the University of Alaska has done the work that Nist failed to do on Building 7 and has concluded that in order for that building to collapse, all the columns had to have been removed within a second of each other. So, yeah, that's pretty revealing information that they took 4 years and $300,000 to put together. So that important work to download. By the way, that's documented here in this film called 7, which you can watch. Go to our website, ae911truth.org, and find out how to watch that film. It's on Amazon Prime, though, right now. We've also submitted a request for correction to Nist, another one, and this one about Building 7. So they're on the hook now, and we have appealed their negative response, and we will sue them if we get another one. We want you to take this to Congress. Andy, how do they do that?
That's right. Congress is the supreme law of the land, and that's what the petition is designed for. It's a petition to Congress to reinvestigate all this information that Richard has been talking about. So the way you can do that first is find out who your congressman is. It's amazing how many people don't actually know that in this country. But find out who your congressman is, and then go to his website, his or her website, I should say, and find out how you can request a meeting. It's a pretty straightforward thing. Usually in a box, you can just select that. They have that as a subject line. And so you want to have a phone meeting between yourself and representatives of AE 911 Truth. And contact us as well at congress@ae911truth.org. Let us know what happened. We'll help you along the way. And I think we lost Richard just now. His face just disappeared in the top corner. So unless I hear his voice in just a moment, I guess I'll take over until he comes back. But it's so important to do this because we have different opinions about politics in this country. We have different opinions about what should actually be done. However, science is standard. You can't argue with science even though they try to, and that should be a bipartisan issue. So we can go to them with this information and keep on hitting them. And the thing about Congress too is that it can change. So that's why it's so important. Richard, you're back.
Yay!
You disappeared for a second on me. So that's also too, when you talk to them, you got to have something that you're asking for. Not just say, I want a new investigation as some kind of abstract thought, but actually have something you can give them, tell them to get behind. So here we have the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act, the path to justice for the almost 3,000 people who died that day. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed as he was entering the North Tower that day. He was entering the lobby. He was killed by an explosion. And what this is, it's draft legislation that would create a select committee to investigate the controlled demolition evidence. But Congress doesn't actually do anything unless they hear from their constituents. Otherwise, they're just happy to go along with their own agenda. So that's why they need to hear from you. That's why I need to get involved, call them, contact them, and set up these phone meetings. So if you have any questions about it, just go to we'll go to ae911truth.org, of course. Go to ae911truth.org/justice, which is our page dedicated to this. You can also write us at congress@ae911truth.org as well.
Fantastic. And realize also that we have submitted a grand jury petition to the U.S. Attorney, and he is obligated by law to give that to the special grand jury, the 60 exhibits that we've submitted. And we're in legal back and forth to try to make that happen, as we are still with the FBI lawsuit, because they were responsible for giving to Congress, as a result of the 2015 9/11 Commission review, the evidence that we have given them, and we have proof that they have seen it as well. They've even responded to it. So we've also created and raised funds to support the efforts of the Campbell family to help get a new inquest into their family members, Jeff Campbell, who was murdered in the 126th floor of the North Tower as a result of explosions, and not plane impacts causing fires that caused the weakening of steel, which caused the collapse of the building. So there's proof of that, which we've also given. And this month, we will be submitting that petition. So stand by. Heads will roll as family members join on to that effort. And we never stop making our best efforts to get the evidence into the legal system and into the governmental system and into the academic system. Speaking of which, we have now 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all in this documentary. 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. I want to show you just a 4-minute excerpt here, and then we'll answer your questions, because I imagine you have some really good ones tonight.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. I know that there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what Nist has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA and Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
if this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah, you can watch this. It's free on YouTube, the 1-hour version, or you can get the 90-minute version, which is extraordinary, including the psychology of 9/11, why it's so difficult to get people to understand or to even look at the evidence in the first place. And there's additional bonus DVD placed here where you can see the extended interviews from the experts as well. Be sure to download our 50-page booklet. It's free, and or you can get the on beyondmisinformation.org, or you can get the coffee table version, which comes with a disc of 9/11 explosive evidence experts speak out. That's the one I recommend. I think it's $15 or $20 for that pairing. And the classic lecture on this series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, free on YouTube, as is the first World Trade Center 7 documentary we made, 15 minutes long, narrated by actor Ed Asner. But let's get to those questions, Andy.
Okay, the first one asks, how can they detonate the explosives where the jets hit? Wouldn't the crashes have disrupted the explosives?
That's a great question. You know what? The first answer is we don't have to know that. We have evidence that of explosives, and as you'll see next week in this 3-part series, incendiaries at the World Trade Center. And it's the fact that we have evidence means that it has to be answered. Now, if there were explosives placed on every floor, which I believe, if the plane damaged some of those, the building is still going to come down. It's not like they're wired in series, which means the path of detonation was interrupted by the airplane. No, they're designed to go off independently, wirelessly, presumably. That's a speculation. And that all the rest of the explosives would work. Andy, do you have any other thoughts regarding that question?
Well, that's a question debunkers will ask, and it's sort of a desperate question because they want to come at you as if we're somehow in on the plot and we're part of it and knew every single detail of how it was done. But, I mean, if you can look at the science and show that the official story is incorrect and that there had to be explosives involved, then that's enough to justify a new investigation. It's almost like if you have a murder where somebody, the police want to claim that the person repeatedly shot themselves in the back of the head with a shotgun. They want to say, well, how could an intruder get into the house? It was a pretty secure house. Well, I know, but the forensic evidence shows that this person didn't commit suicide. So you have to look into how they did that. So no, you don't have to know every detail, like Richard said. You just have to look at what the laws of physics say and at all the physical evidence of explosives and know that there were explosives involved. So that's my 2 cents.
Good point.
Next one is, has Bazant ever mentioned how he could come up with the WTC theory so quick?
I don't know that he's been asked or that he's answered that question. But boy, he wasn't watching TV. I mean, that is weeks and if not months worth of work crammed into those 4 pages. So he obviously got an early start, and to manipulate the figures as he did, must have taken him that long just to provide that fraudulent report with those falsified inputs for those calculations, which rigged the collapse calculations at least 12-1, if not 24-1, in favor of a collapse.
Okay, next one is from YouTube. It says, how is a large burst of flame possible at the time the top chunk starts dropping at free fall acceleration? Nist, what is generating all the billowing flame?
Well, I've thought about this. I don't know what it is. We saw that billowing flame earlier in today's webinar in the video. It could be jet fuel that wasn't previously ignited, being ignited by the mechanical action of the downward movement of one floor with an incredible rush of air fanning the newly ignited jet fuel. That's my speculation. Do you have one, Andy?
I don't. I think this is a question more directed towards Nist, as we get a lot of those, and I can understand why people would direct the questions that challenge the official story at us, because we seem to know what we're talking about regarding the fall of the towers than Nist does. But really, these questions should be directed towards Nist to answer, because they're the ones who have to explain themselves.
And we have enough of these type of questions now to write a book on the subject. So I'm encouraging those of you in the audience who are so inclined to take these questions and format them to send them to Nist. I would love to see that done.
That is it. I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time, and it's just one of those things that sort of gets pushed down, but we really should do that at some point and come up with a book or something. We can send them the book. So it'd be like Deep Thoughts or something philosophical you'd see at Walmart, but it's really just directed to Nist, because we get a lot of these great questions that they should explain. This is also from YouTube. What kind of perturbation would cause matter to implode to dust and have this energy projection?
So I'm assuming perturbation means, in this case, occurrence, a destructive occurrence, or disruption. And we're talking about 90,000 tons of concrete that has been pulverized to a fine powder and is found in the blanket of dust 3 inches thick throughout lower Manhattan, and is found pulverized to a fine powder, 100 microns large on average, as detected in the dust. Up to 30% of the dust is concrete in different locations. So what could cause that? Can incendiaries cause that? Not typically. Can high energy explosives cause that? Oh yeah. You put high energy explosives near concrete and you will pulverize it. A lot of high energy explosives are necessary in this case. Maybe nanothermite could do it. Maybe not. It was found to be explosive. I mean, we'll look at this very carefully next week, by the way. You're going to see that when you bring the particles of thermite down to the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than a human hair, the surface volume increases exponentially. So the chemical reaction occurs virtually instantaneously. So they've engineered, as you'll see, an incendiary to become much more explosive. If that incendiary were painted on the bottom of the metal decking underneath the floors of the World Trade Center, and we have reason to believe that that's the case because it's found in dual layered red-gray chips indicating a fluid application, maybe that's enough to pulverize the concrete. And if not, certainly high energy explosives could explain that. What doesn't explain that is directed energy weapons or nuclear weapons, which have been postulated as being among the destructive forces applied at the World Trade Center by the perpetrators. We have detailed FAQs on this subject on our website at ae911truth.org/FAQ. So you'll find those answers there. In the case of nuclear weapons, 40 pages on it, and in the case of directed energy weapons, a 4-page presentation on our findings regarding that possibility. Andy, you have any other thoughts on that one?
No, look at the FAQs. We've fully addressed this. So that's it. That's all I have to say. And I want to say for my part, thank you everyone for tuning in today.
Yeah, and thank you, Andy, for helping us out. We've looked at the Twin Towers explosive destruction today with an overview of the Twin Towers, the explosions, hundreds of witnesses, sudden near free fall collapses, high velocity lateral ejections, shattering the steel frame, the midair pulverization of concrete, which leads us into part 3, which we'll look at next week, 1 week from today, Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific. The Twin Towers in extreme heat, which we dive into the molten steel and iron, the iron microspheres of thermite, nanothermite, hot, very hot pyroclastic clouds, and that the fact that these high-rise fires couldn't possibly be explain any of this phenomena. So join us, and the week after that, the first week in June, we'll come back and look at part 1 again if you missed it. So join us then. Until next week, thanks everybody, and thanks Andy. We'll catch up with you later, and